They gave the Alpha King a broken Omega as a joke, but he claimed her before the moon set. Mountains loomed like dark sentinels, their peaks hidden in drifting mist, and rivers ran black as ink under the pale light of the twin moons. It was in this land of fading light that the Alpha King ruled, a man spoken of in fear and awe, Kale, whose name alone could bend nobles to silence. His power was unmatched, not merely in strength, but in the mysterious forces that surrounded him. People said his shadow carried the weight of death itself, and none dared cross him without trembling. Yet the nobles of Urendor, cruel and jealous, had grown careless in their arrogance. They had grown bold enough to joke about Kale's reputation. A cruel plan formed, whispered in dark corners of the castle. They would present him with a fragile Omega, one marked by scars of a hidden curse, as if mocking the idea of a powerful king claiming anything but perfection. They did not see it as a gift, they saw it as a game, a joke, a test of his temper. But fate had always been unkind to those who underestimated the Alpha King. Lyra, the girl chosen for this cruel jest, had walked the shadowed halls of the nobles' court in silence. Her body bore signs of weakness, a curse that left her drained under the phases of the moon. But beneath the fragile exterior, her mind was sharp, and her heart held the stubborn flicker of defiance. She had learned early that the world would see her as broken, but she also carried a secret within, a hidden strength she had yet to fully understand. The nobles thought her powerless. They were wrong. When the announcement was made, Lyra was brought into the great hall of Kale's fortress. The hall itself seemed alive, its high ceilings carved from black stone, chandeliers of silver and crystal reflecting the dim moonlight, and tapestries depicting battles that had shaped the kingdom. The air was heavy, scented with iron and smoke, as if the hall itself remembered every act of bloodshed and betrayal that had occurred within its walls. It was here, under the gaze of the Alpha King, that the court's cruelty would unfold. Kale entered as if the shadows themselves had given him form. His presence was immediate, suffocating, yet mesmerizing. He was tall, with hair dark as midnight and eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to read the soul beneath. Every step he took echoed in the hall, and the courtiers instinctively bowed, their earlier amusement forgotten. When his gaze landed on Lyra, a silence deeper than fear fell. The nobles' laughter faltered. For a moment, it seemed as though the world itself paused. Lyra felt the weight of his eyes like a physical force. She wanted to shrink back, to disappear into the shadows, but something within her refused. There was a strange pull in Kale's gaze, as if he could see not the brokenness the court mocked, but the quiet strength she had hidden for years. Her pulse quickened, half in fear, half in wonder. The Alpha King's presence was a storm, terrifying and consuming, yet strangely magnetic. Kale's voice cut through the hall, low and smooth, carrying authority and curiosity. "They think you are weak," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Do you know what that makes you?" His tone was neither cruel nor kind. It was probing, a test she could not yet name. Lyra swallowed hard, unsure whether to answer, yet her heart urged her to meet him, not flee. They call me broken," she said quietly, her voice trembling but clear. "But I am still here." She did not fully understand why she said it, only that she could not let him see her as entirely defeated. She had survived this long, and in some corner of her mind, she hoped survival itself might be enough to defy expectation. Kale's expression shifted, a faint trace of a smile brushing his lips, though his eyes remained stormy. "Still here," he repeated, and the words sounded both approving and dangerous. Without another word, he stepped closer, and the air seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken power. "Then you belong to me," he declared, his voice carrying across the hall like the roll of distant thunder. "Before the moon sets, I claim you." Gasps echoed through the hall. The nobles froze, unable to comprehend that their jest had backfired. Their fragile joke had become a serious matter in the Alpha King's eyes, and the girl they had mocked was no longer merely an object. They had unknowingly placed her at the center of a storm. Lyra's heart raced. She should have felt fear, but beneath it, a strange spark of curiosity flickered. The man before her was not merely a tyrant. He was a force, and somehow in this strange, terrifying claim, she felt the pull of destiny. Kale extended his hand, and for the first time, Lyra hesitated. To take it was to step into the unknown, to accept a bond she did not yet understand. Yet the alternative, a life under the jeers of the nobles, powerless and mocked, felt worse. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she placed her hand in his. The moment their skin touched, a shiver ran through her, like electricity running along her spine. The shadows of the hall seemed to bend closer, as if acknowledging the claim, as if the very air recognized the gravity of this union. As Kale led her through the fortress, the corridors whispered of ancient power. Statues of kings and queens long dead lined the walls, their stone eyes glimmering with faint, otherworldly light. Lyra sensed that these halls remembered every act of courage and betrayal that had occurred within them. She wondered what stories Kale's own life had written on these walls, and whether she would ever dare to uncover them. The Alpha King walked silently, but every step was deliberate, commanding. She followed, feeling both fear and an undeniable fascination. That night, Lyra was brought to her chamber, a room larger than many entire houses in the villages beyond the mountains. Velvet drapes hung heavy over tall windows, filtering the pale moonlight into soft, ghostly patterns on the floor. The furniture was simple yet elegant, carved from dark wood and silvered stone. Despite the beauty, an aura of solemnity clung to the room, a reminder that this was a place of power, not comfort. Lyra stood near the window, gazing at the twin moons and the mountains beyond, feeling the enormity of her new reality pressing down on her. Kale entered silently, as though drawn by instinct rather than invitation. His presence filled the room, overwhelming yet strangely protective. Lyra felt a shiver run through her, not of fear but of anticipation. He did not speak at first, merely observing her, studying the lines of her face, the tilt of her shoulders. She felt exposed, yet oddly seen. For the first time in her life, someone looked at her not with pity, not with mockery, but with recognition. Recognition of something hidden, something powerful, something worth claiming. "Do you understand the path you have stepped onto?" Kale finally asked, his voice soft but edged with steel. "Once you are claimed, there is no turning back. The court may mock you, the world may doubt you, but here, under my shadow, you will either rise or you will break." His words were not threats, they were truth. Lyra's pulse quickened. She had always feared breaking. Yet perhaps for the first time she wondered if rising might also be possible. She began, then faltered, unsure of how to speak the truths churning within her. "I will try," she whispered. The words sounded small, almost fragile, yet in the quiet of that shadowed chamber they carried weight. She did not yet know what she could endure, what power lay hidden within her, but for the first time she felt that someone believed she could find it. Kale's gaze softened fractionally, though his intensity never wavered. "Good," he said, and there was a rare note of approval, a promise that he saw not merely the girl they called broken, but the woman she could become. "Rest. Tomorrow you will begin to understand the true nature of this claim." With that, he turned and left, leaving Lyra alone with the night, the shadows, and the first stirrings of something she could not name, an emotion equal parts fear, wonder, and longing. Hours later, as she drifted into restless sleep, Lyra felt the subtle tug of magic in the fortress, a presence both protective and commanding. Somewhere deep within her, a pulse of power responded, hesitant yet curious. And far above, the moons traced their slow paths across the sky, marking the time before destiny would demand its first reckoning. Somewhere in the silent corridors of the Alpha King's fortress, a bond had been forged, one that would not easily be broken, and one that would challenge both the strength and the heart of the girl they had called broken. Outside, in the cold silence of the mountains, shadows shifted. Forces long forgotten stirred, drawn to the fragile bond between King and Omega. The night itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to begin. Lyra did not yet know it, but her life had changed irrevocably. The game of nobles, meant as a cruel joke, had set the stage for something far larger, something that could either destroy them both or forge a power greater than any kingdom had ever known. And somewhere deep in the darkness, Cale felt the first stirrings of unease and desire intertwined. The girl they had brought as a mockery was no mockery at all. She was the key to something older than the throne, older than the mountains, older than the moons themselves. And as the night pressed on, both of them would discover that destiny, once claimed, does not wait, and neither does the bond that had already begun to take root between them. Cliffhanger. When the dawn comes, their bond will be tested, and the game the nobles played as a joke may turn into a fight for survival neither of them expected. The dawn broke over Cale's fortress with a quiet gravity, painting the jagged towers in pale silver and soft gold. Lyra had not slept well. The night had been heavy with shadows and whispers she could not place. The fortress seemed alive, each corridor murmuring secrets in a language older than the mountains themselves. Her body felt fragile, but her mind, sharpened by fear and determination, refused to yield. Today would mark the first of many lessons, Cale had warned, but she did not yet understand the nature of what she was about to face. The Alpha King appeared before her as if summoned by thought rather than motion. Cale's presence carried the same weight as the night itself, dark, commanding, yet with an intensity that made the air thrum. His gaze fell on her, unreadable yet perceptive, and for a moment Lyra felt herself measured in ways that frightened and fascinated her in equal measure. "You awake?" Cale asked, his voice calm, yet edged with unspoken challenge. "Yes," Lyra replied, standing straighter than she felt. "I am ready to learn." Cale's lips curved faintly, almost imperceptibly. "Ready," he said, as though testing the word, its meaning heavier than mere willingness. "Then we begin." He led her through corridors she had not noticed before, hallways lined with statues of warriors and kings long gone. Their eyes, carved from onyx, seemed to follow her, watching her every step. Lyra felt a chill crawl along her spine, but also a strange sense of belonging, as though the shadows themselves acknowledged her presence. Cale's hand rested briefly on her shoulder, not in tenderness, but as a mark of authority. She did not flinch, and Cale's eyes flickered with something unreadable. The first lesson was not one of words but of awareness. Cale moved through the courtyard with precision, demonstrating control over his own strength, his ability to sense threats before they arose. Lyra watched, enthralled and wary, recognizing the difference between raw power and disciplined mastery. She had been trained in silence and survival, but nothing had prepared her for this. "You will need more than fear to survive here," Cale said suddenly, breaking her reverie. "You will need understanding, awareness, control, and you will need to face what you hide within yourself." Lyra nodded, though the weight of the statement pressed heavily on her chest. Cale's words were simple, yet they carried the promise of challenges she could not yet imagine. He stopped in a small garden tucked behind the fortress walls, where black stone paths wound between twisted trees and silvered pools. Mist hovered low, and the scent of unknown flowers filled the air, mingling with the faint tang of magic that lingered here. "This is where you will learn to sense the currents," Cale said, pointing to the pools. "They are not mere water. They carry life, memory, and danger. The fortress is alive in ways you do not yet understand. To survive, you must learn its language." Lyra stepped closer, gazing into the pool. The water rippled unnaturally, reflecting not just her own face, but fleeting images she could not place. Shadows of creatures, shapes of distant mountains, the glint of weapons long lost. She felt a strange pulse, a resonance within her chest as though something deep inside recognized what the waters whispered. "Feel it," Kale instructed. "Let the currents speak to you. Let them show you what you are." She closed her eyes, breathing slowly, and allowed herself to listen. At first, all she sensed was fear, the echo of the court's mockery, the sting of being claimed. Then a warmth rose within her, subtle and strange, as if the shadow of her curse, the weakness that had haunted her since childhood, was not a chain but a key. The water pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and for the first time she glimpsed a spark of her hidden power. Kale watched her carefully, silent as the garden itself seemed to lean closer. "Not many notice this," he said. "Few see what lies beneath. You may be stronger than even you suspect." Lyra opened her eyes, startled by the thought. "Stronger, but I am weak." "I always have been. Only when you believe you are," Kale said, stepping closer. "Strength is not the absence of weakness, Lyra. It is the courage to act despite it." Her heart pounded, not just from his words, but from the intensity of his gaze. It was a gaze that weighed, measured, and judged, not with cruelty, but with a demand for truth. For the first time, Lyra felt a flicker of understanding. Perhaps this claim, this bond with Kale, was not meant to break her, but to awaken her. The lessons continued, each more demanding than the last. Kale guided her through exercises of agility and perception, teaching her to move with awareness, to sense the subtle currents of energy that flowed through the fortress. Lyra faltered many times, her body weary, her mind questioning her own strength. Yet each time she stumbled, Kale's hand or presence steadied her, not with comfort but with expectation. She began to understand that his approval was not freely given. It had to be earned, and every mistake carried weight. By the third lesson, Kale introduced her to the supernatural guardians of the fortress. Shadow creatures, neither fully beast nor entirely spirit, emerged from the darkness. Their forms were fluid, their eyes glowing like embers. Lyra froze, instinct screaming at her to run, but Kale's hand on her back was steady, grounding. "Do not fear them," he instructed. "They are as much a part of you as of me. Your power, your curse, they will recognize the truth of your spirit. Do not resist, do not flee, accept them." Lyra nodded, trembling but determined. As she stepped forward, the shadows swirled around her, sensing her presence, and a strange warmth spread through her chest. It was not fear, nor strength, nor weakness. It was recognition. The creatures did not attack. They circled, observing, and then slowly receded, leaving her standing in the moonlit courtyard, breathless but unbroken. Kale's eyes met hers, and a rare softness touched his expression. "You see now," he said. "Even the shadows obey only those who understand them. You are beginning to see yourself, Lyra, and only when you see yourself will you be able to face me, not as your master, but as someone bound to your fate." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Lyra did not fully understand, but the tension in her chest told her the truth. Her life here would not be easy, and yet she had never felt more alive. The pull toward Kale, the fear, the awe, the strange flicker of something deeper, all of it mingled within her, forming a knot of emotion she could neither deny nor unravel. As the sun dipped and twilight returned, the fortress seemed to breathe with anticipation. Kale led her to the library, a vast chamber filled with ancient tomes and scrolls. The scent of old parchment mingled with faint traces of incense and magic. Here, he intended to teach her not just to fight, but to understand the history of the kingdom, the legacy of curses, and the forces that could manipulate both men and beasts. Lyra pored over the texts, absorbing tales of kings who had fallen to greed, queens who had wielded magic beyond reckoning, and warriors who had been bound by fate to serve powers larger than themselves. As she read, she began to understand a truth she had not considered. The curse that had marked her as weak was not a punishment, but a key, a piece of a story that intertwined with the Alpha King's own destiny. Her mind spun with the weight of knowledge, but before she could process it fully, Kale's voice called softly from behind her. "You have the heart to see, Lyra, but will you have the courage to act? Will you face what is coming, or will you let it break you?" Lyra turned to face him, her eyes bright with determination. "I will face it," she said, and for the first time she believed it. Not because she was unafraid, but because she understood that courage was not the absence of fear. It was acting despite it. Kale's gaze lingered on her, intense and unreadable. "Good," he said. "Tomorrow the real test begins. You will not be alone, but the shadows will not yield. You will need every part of yourself, Lyra, every spark of strength you possess, and some you do not yet know exists." As night fell fully, Lyra stood by her window, gazing at the twin moons over the fortress. Her pulse thrummed with the promise of challenges to come, with the weight of a bond that neither she nor Kale could yet define. The shadows stirred as if alive, whispering secrets of fate, destiny, and power. Somewhere deep within the fortress, Kale watched her from the darkness, a shadow among shadows. He felt the first true pull of concern for her, not for possession, but for the fragile, flickering force she carried within her. He knew the bond they shared was no mere claim. It was something older, something deeper, and it would demand everything of them both. And as the night pressed on, a distant rumble echoed through the mountains, a warning, a promise, a shadow of danger yet to come. Lyra's first lessons had begun, but the true trials were only just unfolding. In the days to come, she would face not just the strength of the fortress, nor the cunning of the shadows, but the complexity of Kale himself, the power he wielded, and the bond that had begun to twist fate around them both. Cliffhanger. Somewhere beyond the walls, a force had begun to stir, drawn to the bond between the Alpha King and the Omega. When it strikes, it will test everything she has learned, and everything Kale believes about her strength. Neither of them will be the same. The morning air in Kale's fortress was thick with mist, and the scent of damp stone and iron mingled with the faint perfume of strange, unseen flowers. Lyra had risen before dawn, her thoughts tangled in the lessons of the previous day. The fortress no longer felt merely like walls and corridors of cold stone. It was alive, breathing and watching, as if aware of every heartbeat, every fear, every hidden strength. Her pulse quickened at the thought of the trials yet to come, for Kale's words from the night before had not faded from her mind. "You will not be alone," he had said. "The shadows will not yield. You will need every part of yourself." Now, as she walked the silent halls, she understood the gravity of his statement. The shadows were patient, silent observers that tested the resolve of those who entered the fortress. Even the courtiers who dared tread its corridors seemed smaller here, diminished by the sense that the walls themselves measured their worth. Lyra had once thought herself powerless, weak, and insignificant, but the fortress whispered a different truth. Kale appeared without warning, as if summoned by thought. His presence filled the corridor like a storm contained within human form. He did not smile, but his eyes held the intensity of someone who had watched too many fates twist and crumble. "Today the real test begins," he said, "not of strength but of control, of spirit, of the courage to face what is within you." Lyra followed him in silence, her heartbeat steadying despite the pull of unease in her chest. Kale led her to the Hall of Echoes, a vast chamber she had not seen before. Its walls were carved with intricate runes, glowing faintly in the half-light. The air hummed with energy, subtle and almost imperceptible, and Lyra felt a tingle run down her spine. "This place," Kale said, "reflects what lies within you. The shadows you fear, the power you deny, the truth you hide. Look into it and you will see yourself, not as the world labels you, but as you are." Lyra stepped forward cautiously. The runes along the walls pulsed, as though breathing, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to ripple with faint energy. When she gazed into the reflective black stone in the center of the hall, she did not see her own pale face but 1,000 fragments of herself, Fear, courage, weakness, strength, sorrow, defiance. Her breath caught in her throat. "You see," Kale's voice was soft but commanding. "The curse that marks you is not merely a weakness. It is a mirror, a reflection of what you fear to admit. Only when you accept it can you command it rather than be consumed by it." Lyra's mind raced. She had always believed the curse made her fragile, a pawn in the games of others. But the Hall of Echoes suggested something different. Her weakness was not a flaw, it was a key, a hidden channel of power waiting to be unlocked. Yet the idea frightened her more than it inspired her. To confront what was inside was to risk everything she had held onto for survival. "Do you understand?" Kale asked, stepping closer, the shadows of the hall curling around him as though drawn to his presence. "If you deny yourself, the curse will break you. If you embrace yourself, it will strengthen you. But the path is never simple. It requires honesty, courage, and trust. Trust in yourself and perhaps trust in me." Lyra hesitated, swallowing the lump in her throat. The bond between them, first forged in the cruelty of the court, now pressed upon her in subtle, insistent ways. Kale was not merely her master, her alpha. He was a force she could not ignore, an unpredictable storm she could neither flee nor fully control. And somewhere deep within her, a flicker of desire for understanding, for connection, began to rise. She did not yet name it, but it was there. "I will try," she said finally. I will face it." Kale's gaze lingered, intense and unreadable. He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, a gesture brief and fleeting, yet charged with unspoken meaning. "Good," he said. "Then begin." The Hall of Echoes responded immediately, the runes glowing brighter, the shadows shifting and coiling as if alive. Lyra felt a pull at her chest, a tug she could neither resist nor fully understand. Images of past failures, fears, and hidden strengths swirled before her eyes, each one demanding acknowledgement. She fell to her knees, overwhelmed, yet something within her rose to meet the challenge. "Focus," Kale's voice cut through the chaos. "Do not flee from yourself. The strength you seek is already here." Lyra took a trembling breath and closed her eyes, letting the energy of the hall flow through her. At first, it was overwhelming, almost suffocating, but then she felt a subtle resonance within herself, a rhythm that matched the pulse of the fortress. Her heartbeat aligned with the energy of the room, her fear transforming into awareness. The shadows, once threatening, now seemed to respond to her presence, coiling around her in acknowledgement rather than attack. Kale watched silently, noting the subtle shifts in her posture, the steadying of her breath. He had seen many attempt the trials of the Hall of Echoes, but few had endured more than a few moments without faltering. Lyra's resilience surprised him, not in raw strength, but in the courage and focus she exhibited despite the shadows of her curse. "You are beginning to see," Kale said, his voice softer now. "But the journey is not complete. The bond between us, it is more than claim. It is entwined with fate, and fate will test you as much as I do. The forces seeking you are already stirring. The curse is not isolated. It is part of a larger design, and you cannot face it alone." Lyra's mind swirled with questions, but she did not speak. The room itself seemed to hum in acknowledgement, the shadows whispering in a language she did not yet understand. Somewhere deep in her chest, she felt a pulse of power she had never recognized before, a subtle growing force that spoke of strength, resilience, and an unspoken connection to Kale. The training continued for hours, blending physical endurance, mental focus, and the subtle exploration of her own abilities. Kale was relentless, yet fair, pushing her beyond the limits she had imposed upon herself. He tested her reactions, her perception, and her ability to sense danger before it arrived. And through it all, the bond between them deepened, not in words but in shared glances, in silent acknowledgments, in the quiet understanding that both were bound to forces larger than themselves. As evening fell, the fortress seemed to shift again. Shadows lengthened, and a faint wind carried an unfamiliar scent, earth, smoke, and something older, something ancient. Lyra paused, sensing a disturbance in the air, a presence she could not yet name. Kale's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. "You feel that," he said quietly. "It is not a threat yet, but it will become one. Your awakening has drawn attention. Forces that have lain dormant for centuries are stirring. You must be ready." Lyra nodded, her pulse quickening. The trials of the day had been exhausting, yet this warning carried weight far beyond physical fatigue. It was a reminder that their bond and her emerging strength would not go unnoticed. The world outside the fortress, with its shadows, its secrets, and its dangers, was awakening to the power that had been quietly growing within her. That night, Kale did not leave her chamber. He remained at the edge of the room, silent, watching. Lyra, exhausted but restless, could not sleep. The events of the day, the whispers of the shadows, and the pull she felt toward Kale combined into a knot of thoughts and emotions that refused to settle. She rose, moving to the window to gaze at the twin moons. The pale light cast long shadows across the walls, and she sensed the subtle currents of magic in the air, the faint pulse of the fortress itself. "You are restless," Kale said, his voice soft yet resonant, breaking the silence. I cannot sleep," Lyra admitted. "There is too much I do not understand." He stepped closer, the shadows around him curling with a life of their own. "You are not meant to understand everything at once," he said. "The bond between us, the curse, your strength, it will reveal itself in time. But you must learn patience, as well as courage. Both are necessary if you are to survive what is coming." Lyra's eyes met his, and for a long moment the unspoken tension between them hung in the room. There was fear, certainly, but also a strange, growing connection, an understanding that they were bound not just by claim, but by destiny. She did not yet know the full measure of what that bond meant, only that it pulled her toward him in ways she could neither deny nor fully comprehend. And then, from deep within the fortress, a low rumble echoed, subtle at first, then growing in intensity. The shadows along the walls shifted violently, and the air thickened with a presence neither of them had anticipated. Lyra's pulse surged, and Kale's eyes darkened with focus and concern. "The time is coming sooner than I expected," he said. "Something approaches. Something that will test us both and the bond we share. You must be ready, Lyra, ready to face not just what is outside, but what lies within you." Lyra nodded, determination hardening in her chest. She had faced fear before, but this was different. This was not merely survival. It was awakening, understanding, and the quiet forging of strength that could no longer be denied. As the night deepened and the fortress whispered around them, Lyra felt a subtle surge of power within herself, a recognition that she was no longer merely the girl they had called broken. She was becoming something more, a force entwined with the Alpha King, bound by fate, and prepared to meet whatever shadow dared challenge them. Cliffhanger. The bond between Kale and Lyra had awakened forces long dormant, and something ancient was moving toward them, a power that would not wait for their readiness. When it strikes, neither Kale nor Lyra will be able to rely on strength alone. The next night will test not only their courage, but the very connection that has begun to entwine their destinies. The wind howled across the jagged peaks surrounding Kale's fortress, carrying with it the scent of smoke, earth, and an ancient power that seemed older than the mountains themselves. Lyra stood at the edge of the terrace, the twin moons casting silver light on her hair and the contours of her face. Every lesson, every trial, every heartbeat since she had arrived in this fortress had led to this moment. The shadows around her stirred, alive with anticipation, as if the walls themselves had drawn a deep breath and were waiting for the inevitable. Kale approached silently, his presence as commanding and steady as the mountains behind him. His dark hair whipped slightly in the wind, his eyes glowing with intensity. The bond between them, formed in the crucible of trials, shared moments of fear, courage, and discovery, had deepened into something neither could fully name. It was trust, yes, but also more, a connection that tied their fates together with threads older than memory. "They are coming," Kale said, his voice low and resonant. "The force I warned you of. They have been stirred by your awakening, Lyra. We cannot hide and we cannot falter." Lyra nodded, feeling the surge of power within her pulse and limbs. The hall of echoes, the shadows, the whispers of the fortress, all of it had prepared her for this confrontation. She was no longer the fragile girl the nobles had mocked. She was awakening into her true strength, her curse now a key rather than a chain. She stood taller, the rising tide of her courage matched by the quiet fire in Kale's eyes. "I am ready," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever comes, I will face it." Kale's expression softened briefly, the faintest shadow of a smile brushing his lips. "Good. Then we face it together." The ground trembled as they descended into the fortress courtyard, the air charged with energy. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, flickering and twisting in ways that defied logic. From the darkness beyond the walls, a presence emerged, massive, ancient, and radiating power that made the very stones shiver. Figures, both beast and spirit, coalesced from the darkness, their forms flickering like smoke, their eyes glimmering with hunger and intent. This was the force Kale had warned her of, drawn by the awakening of her latent power. Lyra felt the familiar pulse of fear, but she did not allow it to control her. She breathed deeply, feeling the fortress around her, feeling Kale beside her, and reaching inward to the source of her own emerging strength. She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, the air itself seemed to hum in response. Shadows shifted and recoiled, sensing that the girl they had thought fragile was no longer so. Kale moved beside her, his presence a steady anchor. "Do not underestimate them," he warned. "But do not let fear blind you. Use what you have learned. Trust yourself and trust me." The creatures surged forward and the clash began, not with weapons but with a battle of wills and energy. Lyra focused, feeling the currents of magic she had glimpsed in the Hall of Echoes. The shadows of her curse, once a symbol of weakness, now coiled within her like a serpent ready to strike. She extended her hands, and the air pulsed with energy, a barrier forming around her and Kale, pushing back the advancing threat. Kale moved in tandem, each motion precise, each gesture commanding the energy around them. Together they formed a rhythm, a unity born of trust, courage, and necessity. The creatures pressed harder, their forms shifting, adapting, but Lyra's strength had grown beyond her own expectations. She found control within the chaos, directing the energy with clarity and focus, the shadows of her curse flowing in harmony with her will rather than resisting it. "You are stronger than you realize," Kale said, his voice carrying over the tumult. "Do not doubt yourself now." Lyra's heart surged at his words. The bond between them was no longer a burden, no longer merely a claim. It was a partnership forged in trials, fear, and awakening. She felt Kale's presence beside her as both support and challenge, pushing her to embrace everything she had been afraid of, her strength, her curse, her destiny. As the battle reached its peak, a massive shadow broke through the front line, larger and darker than the others. Its eyes burned with an ancient light, and it radiated a malevolent energy that made the ground tremble. Lyra instinctively recognized it. This was the source of the threat, drawn by her own awakening and the bond she shared with Kale. The creature advanced, and the air between them thickened with tension. Kale stepped forward, his hands glowing with energy that radiated outward, meeting the force of the creature. "Stay close," he commanded. "Do not falter. I will not allow them to touch you." Lyra nodded, feeling the strength within her rise to meet the challenge. She extended her own energy, not in defense, but in harmony with Kale's, their powers intertwining. The currents of the fortress, the shadows, and their combined wills surged against the ancient force. The battle became a dance of energy and intent, each motion precise, each response measured. Lyra felt herself becoming part of something larger than herself, a living conduit of power and courage. The creature roared, a sound that shook the mountains, but the surge of unity between Lyra and Kale held firm. She realized in a sudden clarity that her curse had never been a limitation. It had been a resonance, a connection to forces beyond ordinary understanding. She embraced it fully and with a sharp intake of breath, directed the energy toward the creature. The shadows recoiled, twisting and shrinking, as the creature faltered under the combined strength of the Alpha King and his claimed Omega. Kale's gaze met hers, and in that instant Lyra felt a rush of emotion, fear, triumph, trust, and an unspoken recognition of the bond that had brought them to this moment. Together they unleashed a final surge of power, and the creature collapsed, its form dissolving into shadow, leaving silence and a faint glow of energy that slowly receded into the fortress itself. Lyra sank to her knees, exhausted but exhilarated. She had faced the threat, embraced her power, and survived. More importantly, she had understood the true nature of the bond she shared with Kale, not merely claim, not merely power, but trust, unity, and a shared destiny that could not be broken. Kale extended a hand to her, helping her to her feet. His eyes, dark and intense, softened with approval and something else she could not yet name. "You have done well," he said quietly. "Better than I expected. You have embraced yourself, and in doing so, you have changed the course of what was coming. The fortress, the shadows, they recognize your strength now." Lyra's chest heaved, her body trembling from the effort, but a calm settled over her, a quiet assurance that she had crossed a threshold. She was no longer fragile. She was no longer merely the girl the nobles had mocked. She was herself, strong, aware, and bound to Kale in a way that neither power nor curse could undo. "You did not falter," Kale said, his voice a low rumble. "Even when the darkness pressed close, you have grown far beyond what they called broken." Lyra looked at him, her lips curving into a small, exhausted smile. I had help," she said softly. "You guided me, and I trusted you." Kale's eyes softened further, and he allowed himself the smallest of gestures, placing a hand gently over hers, a touch that was not command but connection. "And I trust you," he admitted. "More than you know. You have proven yourself in ways few ever could." The fortress seemed to exhale, the shadows settling into quiet corners, and for the first time, Lyra felt the enormity of what she had accomplished. She had faced fear, embraced her power, and stood beside the Alpha King as an equal in courage and spirit. The trials had not only tested her but transformed her. As the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, painting the fortress in silver and gold, Lyra and Kale stood together, bound by trials, destiny, and an understanding deeper than words. The bond forged in fear, challenge, and awakening had become something enduring, a force that neither the shadows, the curses, nor the world itself could undo. Kale looked toward the horizon, the weight of his responsibility settling over him, tempered by a rare sense of hope. The court, the world beyond these walls, they may never understand this bond, but it does not matter. What matters is here now and the strength we have found in each other. Lyra nodded, feeling the echo of that strength pulse through her chest. "We are stronger together," she said, "not because of the claim, but because of what we have chosen and what we have become." They stood in silence for a long moment, the fortress around them quiet, the threat defeated, and the dawn breaking as a new chapter began. Lyra no longer feared the shadows, for she had learned to command them, to understand them, and to embrace her own power. Kale no longer ruled solely through fear, for he had learned to trust and to guide, not merely control. Together, they had changed the course of destiny. Yet even as they shared that quiet triumph, a subtle pulse of magic lingered in the fortress, a reminder that their journey was not truly over. The bond they had forged would continue to grow, tested by challenges yet unseen, guided by trust, courage, and the recognition of power within themselves and each other. And in that understanding, Lyra and Kale found not only survival, but the quiet promise of a life forged together, stronger than any curse or shadow.